Brother stole everything and gave me a sunken boat as a joke. What I found inside destroyed his entire life. The old house smelled exactly like I remembered. Cedar wood that had been soaking up sea air for 60 years. Dust particles dancing in the afternoon light. And underneath it all, that faint trace of salt that never left. Dad's place had always carried the ocean with it, even though the nearest beach was 3 miles away. Funny how a smell can hit you harder than any photograph. I stood in the living room, my work boots creaking against floorboards that remembered every step I'd taken as a kid. The funeral guests had mostly cleared out, leaving behind casserole dishes and that particular silence that follows death. Outside, a gull screamed. Dad would have laughed at the timing. Then David walked in and everything changed. My brother moved through our father's house like he was touring a property for sale. His cologne, something expensive that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce, cut through the honest smell of home like a chainsaw through pine. Those Italian leather shoes of his clicked against the worn wood, looking about as natural as a tuxedo at a NASCAR race. He'd driven up from Manhattan in his Tesla, of course. Had to make sure everyone saw it parked outside. The remaining family members, Aunt Sarah, Cousin Tommy, and a few others whose names I've forgotten, gathered in the living room. They sensed something coming. David had that look, the one he got before closing a big deal. I'd seen it when we were kids, right before he convinced Mom that whatever trouble we were in was entirely my fault. David cleared his throat, pulling out an iPad from his briefcase. The thing probably cost more than I made in a week. He stood by Dad's old recliner, but didn't sit in it. Even now, even David wouldn't dare. As executor of Dad's will, he started, his voice taking on that professional tone he used with clients. I've completed a full assessment of this estate. He paused for effect. The man always did love his drama. The situation is, frankly, not good. I watched him work the room. He'd gotten good at this over the years, playing the responsible son, the burden bearer. Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the couch. Tommy stared at his phone, pretending not to listen. Me? I just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, waiting. Dad left considerable debts, David continued, swiping through his tablet like he was giving a PowerPoint presentation. More than I initially thought. The only real asset we have is this house. That we'll split everything 50-50. Simple, clean, fair. That's how Dad did things. But David being named executor, that gave him control over how those have got divided. I should have seen it coming when he volunteered to handle all the paperwork. David never volunteered for anything unless there was something in it for him. To cover the obligations, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, I'll have to sell the house. Market's not great right now, but I've found a buyer willing to take it as is. He showed us some numbers on his screen. They looked official enough. After settling the debts and fees, there won't be much left. Tommy finally looked up from his phone. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. The numbers David was showing didn't make sense. Dad had been careful with money his whole life. Never bought anything he couldn't pay cash for. The man still drove a '92 Ford pickup because, as he said, it ain't broke yet. David turned to me then, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Satisfaction? Pity? Hard to tell with him. Michael, I know this is tough, but Dad did specify one thing separately in the will. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an old brass key, rust creeping along its edges like cancer. He wanted you to have the sea wolf. The room went quiet, even quieter than before, if that was possible. David walked over, extending the key toward me. His manicured fingers looked wrong holding something so corroded. He always said you were the one who understood the water, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, with that small, cruel smile I remembered from childhood, he added, Your inheritance is a coffin at the bottom of the sea. Someone, I think it was Tommy, let out a nervous laugh, quickly stifled. David continued, warming to his audience now. The boat's been underwater since that hurricane 5 years ago. Still sitting by the old pier. But hey, Dad always said you were good with your hands. Maybe you can fish it out. The insult hung in the air like fog. Everyone waited for my response. They expected anger, maybe, or shame. That's what David wanted. to see me break, to confirm his superiority in front of family. The successful son versus the failure who worked construction. I took the key. The rust flaked against my palm. Looking David straight in the eye, I said simply, "Thanks. I'll take care of her." His smile faltered slightly. He'd expected more. But I'd learned long ago that the best way to handle David was to not play his games. Besides, something didn't add up. That Rolex on his wrist could have paid off any debt Dad might have had 3 times over. The debts were just convenient cover. We both knew it. But proving it, that was another matter. The family dispersed quickly after that, mumbling condolences and promises to keep in touch that everyone knew were lies. David left first, of course, making sure we all heard his Tesla's artificial engine sound as he pulled away. By evening, I was alone in a house that wouldn't be ours much longer. I drove Dad's old pickup to the pier as the sun started setting. The place looked abandoned, broken boards, rusted chains, and there, about 30 feet from the dock, a dark shadow beneath the water, the Sea Wolf. She'd been a beautiful 35-foot fishing vessel once. Dad had bought her the year I was born, said she was my birthday present to him. Finally had a reason to own a proper boat. Standing at the edge of that rotting pier, key still in my pocket, I thought about Dad. He'd spent 30 years on that boat, taught me to tie knots on her deck, showed me how to read the water, understand the tides. After I came back from Iraq, when the nightmares were bad, we'd take her out before dawn, not talking, just being on the water until my hands stopped shaking. David saw trash, an embarrassment, something to mock me with in front of the family. But I saw it differently. You learn things in the Marines, not just the obvious stuff, how to fight, how to survive. You learn about loyalty, about honor, about never leaving anyone behind. That boat wasn't just fiberglass and wood. She was part of Dad, and David had literally left her to rot. The water looked black in the dying light, cold, unforgiving. The smart play would be to walk away, take the insult, move on. The boat was probably beyond salvage anyway. 4 or 5 years. She'd been a quiet tragedy, a problem for another day. But David had just turned her into an insult, a weapon aimed at me, and I was about to turn it right back at him. It would cost more to raise her than she was worth. Any reasonable person would see that. But then again, reasonable people didn't join the Marines. Reasonable people didn't come back from 2 tours in Iraq and choose to work construction instead of taking a desk job. Reasonable people didn't stand on a broken pier, staring at a sunken boat, planning something impossible. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Billy Morrison's number was still there. We'd served together, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. He ran a salvage operation now, up the coast. Crazy Billy, we'd called him, because he'd volunteer for stuff nobody else would touch. If anyone would understand what I was about to do, it'd be him. But I didn't call. Not yet. First, I needed to think, plan, figure out exactly how to do this. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and decay. Somewhere in the distance, that same gull cried out again. I stood there as darkness fell, looking at the shadow of my inheritance beneath the water. David thought he'd won, thought he'd humiliated me, taken everything, left me with nothing but scrap metal and shame. But he'd made one mistake. He'd forgotten that I wasn't just Dad's son. I was a Marine, and Marines don't leave their people behind, not even when those people are 30 feet underwater. I turned the key over in my pocket, feeling the rust flake away under my fingers. Tomorrow I'd call Billy. Tomorrow I'd start figuring out how to raise the Sea Wolf. It didn't make sense. It wasn't practical. It sure wasn't smart. But it was necessary, because this wasn't about money. It was about something David, with all his spreadsheets and schemes, would never understand. It was about honor. And before this was over, I was going to show him exactly what that meant. The tide was coming in as I walked back to the truck. Behind me, the Sea Wolf waited in her dark grave, but not for much longer. I'd made her a promise, standing on that pier. The same promise I'd made to every Marine I'd ever served with. No one gets left behind. Not even a boat. Not even when everyone thinks you're crazy for trying. The next morning came too fast. My back reminded me I wasn't 25 anymore as I rolled out of bed in Dad's old room. The promise I'd made at the pier felt heavier in daylight. Crazy. That's what it was. But I'd made crazier decisions and lived through them. I stared at Billy Morrison's number for a good 5 minutes before hitting call. The phone rang 3 times. 4. Then that gravelly voice I hadn't heard in 2 years answered with typical Billy eloquence. "Mike, that really you, or am I still drunk from last night?" Same old Billy. I told him it was me. Told him I needed a favor. A big one. The kind that involved getting wet and dirty for no good reason. "Remember that Humvee we pulled out of the mud in Fallujah?" I asked, knowing he would. You don't forget spending 14 hours in 100-degree heat, knee-deep in what we hoped was just mud, trying to save a vehicle that should have been written off. Billy's laugh sounded like a garbage disposal with rocks in it. "You're insane, Mike. That Humvee was easier than whatever you're about to ask me." But I heard it in his voice. He was already in. That's how it worked with Marines. You didn't leave anyone behind, even when that someone was making terrible decisions about sunken boats. 3 days later, Billy showed up with his truck, a trailer full of equipment that looked like it had seen better decades, and a grin that suggested he'd lost more of his sanity since Iraq. He took one look at the shadow under the water and whistled low. 5 years underwater? "Mike, that's not a boat anymore. That's a reef." But he was already walking the pier, calculating angles, mumbling about pontoons and lift bags. Billy could complain all he wanted. He lived for this stuff. Normal people collected stamps. Billy collected impossible problems. We spent the first day just planning. Not the fun kind of planning where you draw things on napkins. The real kind, where every measurement matters and physics doesn't care about your feelings. Billy had brought underwater cameras from his salvage business, the waterproof kind that could survive depths that would crush a person. The footage was sobering. The sea wolf lay on her side, half buried in silt. Barnacles covered her hull like a disease. Her windows were dark holes. She looked exactly like what she was, dead. "You know what this is going to take?" Billy asked, chewing on a toothpick like it owed him money. "Lift bag, compressor, chains, pontoons, probably a crane for final lift. And that's if she doesn't break apart when we try to move her." I knew. I also knew my savings account had about $3,000 in it, and that wouldn't cover the diesel fuel for Billy's truck. But Billy wasn't really asking about equipment. He was asking if I was sure. Marines don't ask that question directly. "I'll figure out," I told him, and somehow I did. Turned out, when you've been doing construction for 15 years in a small coastal town, you accumulate favors. Tommy and Gwen from Marina owed me for fixing his roof after that storm last spring. He lent us pontoons. Old Marcus from the scrapyard had some heavy chains he couldn't sell. Even got some lift bags from a diving shop, whose owner remembered Dad. "Your old man saved my brother's life once," the shop owner said, handing over equipment worth more than my truck. "Pulled him out of a riptide back in '98. This is nothing. Small towns remember. That's something David never understood, living in his Manhattan bubble." The actual work started on a Tuesday, 4 in the morning, because Billy insisted the tide would be perfect. Perfect for what I didn't ask. The sun wasn't even thinking about rising when we got in the water. Let me tell you something about salvage work that Hollywood doesn't show. It's miserable. The water was cold enough to make your bones ache. Visibility was maybe 3 feet on a good day. Every movement stirred up silt that turned the water into chocolate milk. And the smell when you surfaced, low tide mixed with diesel, dead fish, and 5 years of decay. We worked in shifts. 20 minutes underwater, 40 minutes recovering. Billy had the diving experience. But my lungs were younger. We hammered, we tied, we cursed at equipment that didn't want to cooperate. The lift bags had to be positioned perfectly. Too much air and they'd rip loose. Not enough and nothing would happen. By noon, my hands were raw inside the diving gloves. Rust in the chains had worked its way under my fingernails, leaving orange crescents that would take weeks to grow out. My lower back felt like someone had been using it as an anvil. You know this is stupid, right? Billy said during a break, both of us sitting on the pier, steam rising from our wetsuits in the cool air. Yep. And we're probably going to fail? Probably. He grinned, showing the gap where he'd lost a tooth to an IED. Good. I was worried you'd gone soft. Day 3, we tried the first lift. Pumped air into the bags slowly, watching pressure gauges like they were defusing a bomb. The water around the boat started bubbling. Chains groaned. For a moment, just a moment, I saw her move. Then one of the bags ripped. The boat dropped back down, sending up a cloud of silt that made the water look like someone had dropped ink into it. Billy surfaced, coughing. Well, that was exciting, he said, which was Billy's speak, for we almost died. We kept at it, day after day. My savings account hit 0. I sold Dad's truck, keeping just the keys as a reminder. Picked up extra shifts doing drywall at night, showing up to the pier each morning running on 3 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. The town started to notice. People would drive by, slow down, watch 2 idiots trying to raise the dead. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but a few stopped to help. An hour here, an afternoon there. The kid who worked at the hardware store brought us sandwiches one day, wouldn't take money for them. 2 weeks in, my body was done pretending it was young. Everything hurt. I'd lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. Salt water had turned my eyes into a permanent squint. Billy wasn't much better. He developed a cough that sounded like a dying engine. But on day 17, something changed. The morning was calm, no wind, tide just right. We reconfigured the lift bags, reinforced the weak points, said a prayer to whatever God watches over stupid Marines. The bubbles came first, then the groaning of metal and with fighting against physics. The water around the boat turned white with air and effort, and then, like watching a whale breach in slow motion, the sea wolf's bow broke the surface. She came up fighting, water pouring from her wounds, algae streaming like green hair. Not pretty, not graceful, but up after 5 years in the grave. She was breathing again. Billy and I stood on that pier, exhausted, soaked, probably hypothermic, watching this broken boat hang in the water like a question mark. We didn't cheer. Too tired for that. But Billy clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise. Now, what genius, he asked. You got a zombie boat. Congratulations. The crane work came next, getting her actually onto the trailer Billy had borrowed from God knows where. That took another full day in favors I'd be paying back until I died. By sunset, the sea wolf sat on dry land for the first time in 5 years. She looked worse in daylight. Rust had eaten through parts of her hull. The deck was soft with rot. The cabin door hung by one hinge. But she was up. She was out. The first impossible thing was done. We spent the next 3 days just cleaning, shoveling out mud that had turned into concrete, scraping barnacles with tools that hadn't been designed for torture but worked perfectly for it. The smell got worse before it got better. Imagine leaving seafood in your car for a summer, then multiply by 5 years. It was during the cleaning that I found it, back in what used to be the storage area, behind the bait tanks. My scraper hit something that wasn't wood, a dull metallic thunk. When I chipped away the 5-year crust of hardened mud, I saw clean welding lines where they shouldn't be. A section of wall that didn't look right. Too deliberate. Too perfect. Billy was topside, pressure washing something, so I was alone when I pried it open. Behind that false panel was a compartment. Stainless steel, professionally welded, completely waterproof. Dad had built this. Hidden it. The craftsmanship was perfect. He'd spent time on this, planned it. My hand shook a little as I opened it. Don't know what I expected. Cash maybe. Or bonds. Some explanation for why he'd kept this boat, when he could barely afford groceries sometimes. Instead, I found 8 mason jars, each one sealed with wax, wrapped in plastic, then sealed again. Inside was nothing special. Gray-brown chunks of something that looked like dirty soap. Some pieces were hard, others waxy. A few had strange, almost crystalline structures embedded in the waxy surface that caught the light in ways rock or would never would. They smelled faintly organic, like old cheese mixed with ocean. Under the jars, wrapped in tarred canvas that survived the water perfectly, were 3 notebooks. Dad's handwriting covered every page, dates, coordinates, weather conditions. But the entries didn't make sense. Found another gift from the deep. 2 pounds, grade A. The ocean provides for those who wait. Storm brought in a blessing. Small but pure, added to the collection. Page after page of this. 30 years of cryptic notes about the ocean providing gifts, about patience, about waiting for the right moment. At first, I thought Dad had lost it. Maybe the solitude had gotten to him. Old fishermen tell strange stories, start believing and see monsters and mermaids. I sat on that ruined deck, holding those jars of worthless-looking whatever, reading the ramblings of a man I thought I knew everything about. Weeks of backbreaking work, thousands of dollars I didn't have, my body beating hell, all for some jars of ocean garbage in the diary of a maybe crazy man. Billy found me there as the sun was setting. He looked at the jars, the notebooks, my face. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he sat down next to me, pulled out a flask from somewhere, took a sip, and handed it over. "Your dad was a smart man," he said finally. "Yeah." Then explained this. I held up one of the jars. 3 weeks of hell for his weird collection? Billy studied the jar, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mike, you ever wonder how your dad afforded to keep this boat all those years? Man worked part-time at the docks. Your mom passed when you were 15. Where'd the money come from?" I hadn't thought about it. Dad always had just enough. Never more, never less. The boat stayed maintained, barely. We ate, mostly. Life went on. "Maybe," Billy said, standing up with a grunt, "you should figure out what those jars are before you decide this was all for nothing." He left me there with the jars and the notebooks and the dying light. The Sea Wolf creaked under me, still dripping, still broken, but somehow alive. I opened one of Dad's notebooks to a random page. "The ocean keeps its own books," he'd written. "What matters isn't what you take, but what you wait for. Patience is the only currency that matters out here. Michael will understand someday. He has the patience. David never did." My name. He'd written my name 20 years ago, like he'd known, like he'd planned. I looked at those ugly jars again, and for the first time, I wondered if the crazy one wasn't Dad. Maybe it was everyone else. That night, I couldn't sleep. Those jars sat on Dad's kitchen table, like questions waiting for answers. The notebooks lay beside them, 30 years of secrets written in fading ink. Billy's words kept echoing. Where did the money come from? How did Dad keep that boat all those years on a part-time docker salary? I started reading at midnight, made a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and opened the first notebook. The early entries were normal enough, whether patterns, fishing spots, maintenance logs. Boring stuff. But around year 3, things got weird. The ocean spoke today. Left a gift near Devil's Rock. Gray gold, 7 ounces. The old-timers were right. Patience pays in ways money never could. Page after page of this. Cryptic notes about gifts from the deep, about waiting, about something called floating gold. Dad wrote like he was keeping secrets from the paper itself. Coordinates that led nowhere special. Weather conditions that seemed random. And always mentions of patience. Today the wind brought a blessing from Leviathan. For pounds. Salty as a mermaid's tears. Leviathan? Mermaid's tears? My first thought was dementia. Maybe Dad had started losing it out there, alone on the water. Fishermen see things. Isolation plays tricks. The ocean makes people believe in mysteries that don't exist. But the dates were consistent. 30 years of regular entries, methodical as a scientist's lab notes. Whatever Dad was documenting, he'd been serious about it. The man who taught me to measure twice and cut once didn't do anything without purpose. I kept reading. 3 in the morning turned into 4. My eyes burned, but I couldn't stop. There was a pattern here, hidden in the poetry of a careful man. Dad had been hunting something, collecting it, storing it. Then I found it. One phrase that appeared over and over, started about 10 years back. Floating gold. He'd underlined it sometimes, circled at others. The last entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, simply said, "The floating gold is ready. Michael will know when. Michael will know when." He'd written my name like a promise. I grabbed Dad's ancient laptop. The thing still ran Windows XP, because Dad didn't believe in fixing what wasn't broken. The internet connection was dial-up slow, but it worked. Typed floating gold into Google, not expecting much. The first result changed everything. Ambergris, the floating gold worth more than gold itself. I clicked the link, and my world tilted sideways. Pictures filled the screen, gray-brown chunks that looked exactly like what sat in those jars. Waxy, strange, some with crystalline structures. The article explained what ambergris was, a rare substance from sperm whales' digestive systems. When fresh, it smells terrible. But aged properly, it becomes one of the most valuable substances on Earth. Perfume companies paid fortunes for it. We're talking serious money. The good stuff went for $30,000 per pound, sometimes more. My hands shook as I did the math. 8 jars, maybe 2 pounds each, give or take, at even half the premium price. I had to use a calculator 3 times because I didn't believe the numbers. The screen showed articles about fishermen finding chunks worth hundreds of thousands. One piece in Wales sold for almost $1 million. Legal to possess, legal to sell, just incredibly rare. Most people never saw a piece in their lifetime. But Dad had been collecting it for 30 years. I went back to the notebooks with new eyes. The coordinates weren't random. They were spots where currents gathered floating debris. The weather patterns he'd tracked were conditions that brought things to shore. Leviathan wasn't mythology. It was his code for sperm whales. Dad had turned himself into an expert on finding something most people didn't know existed. The genius of it hit me like a sledgehammer. Dad knew David would handle the estate, knew his younger son would look for easy money, liquid assets, bank accounts. David would never think to look inside a sunken boat for jars of what looked like ocean garbage. Even if he had, he wouldn't have known what he was looking at. But Dad knew I'd raise that boat, knew I'd honor the promise in that rusted key. He'd counted on my stubborn pride, the same trait that made me join the Marines, that brought me back to this small town when I could have gone anywhere. The notebooks told the rest of the story. Dad had been planning this for years. Quotes from Melville, notes about patience, observations about his 2 sons. One entry from 15 years ago stopped me cold. David visited today. Looked at my hands like they were dirty. Looked at the boat like it was an embarrassment. He'll never understand that some treasures can't be deposited. Michael came by after, helped fix the engine without being asked. He has salt in his blood. When the time comes, he'll know what to do. Dawn was breaking through the kitchen window. I'd been reading for 6 hours. My coffee had gone cold 4 cups ago. But I understood now. This wasn't just about money. This was about Dad knowing his sons, playing a long game that David couldn't even see. I picked up one of the jars, held it to the light. Inside that ugly wax were 30 years of patience, of secret knowledge, of faith that his older son would do the right thing when the moment came. This wasn't inheritance. It was a test, and David had failed it before it even began. My throat tightened, eyes burned in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt the weight of what I'd lost. Not just a father, but a man who trusted me with his life's secret work. 30 years of watching, waiting, collecting, all for this moment. The next step was clear. I needed verification, official documentation that this was real ambergris. Needed an expert's evaluation. But more than that, I needed a plan, because David had played his hand, thinking he'd won everything. Time to show him what real treasure looked like. I called Billy first. He answered on the second ring, sounding like he'd been awake for hours. "Find something interesting in those jars?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "You knew." "Suspected. Your dad mentioned floating gold once when he'd had too many beers. Didn't make sense then. Makes sense now." I told him everything. The notebooks, the research, the numbers that seemed impossible. Billy whistled low when I got to the values. "So what's the play?" he asked. Classic Billy, Straight to tactics. Remember when we took the hill outside Ramadi? The one everyone said couldn't be taken? Yeah, we took it anyway. Same principle. David thinks he won. Thinks I'm beaten. He's probably planning his victory party right now, celebrating how he cheated his stupid brother. But you got ammunition he doesn't know exists. Exactly. Billy laughed. That rough sound that meant trouble for someone. This is going to be beautiful. The next weeks were preparation. Found a professor at the Maritime College who specialized in marine biology. Sent him a small sample. His response came back 2 days later, practically vibrating with excitement. Exceptional quality. Aged perfectly. Where did you find this? Got the full evaluation report. Official letterhead. Scientific verification. Estimated value. For $0.2 million for the full collection. The professor offered to buy it himself, but I had other plans. Next came the lawyer. Found one who specialized in estate law. Showed him David's paperwork from the house sale. Took the man about 30 minutes to find the fraud. David had sold Dad's house to a shell company owned by his college roommate for a third of its value. The paperwork was sloppy. David had gotten arrogant. Assumed I'd never look. This is criminal breach of fiduciary duty, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. He violated his obligation as executor. We can pursue both civil and criminal charges. Perfect, but I wasn't ready yet. Timing mattered. David had taught me that, ironically enough, strike when they're comfortable, when they think they've won. The invitation came 3 weeks later. David was throwing a party at his new house, bought with Dad's money, though he didn't advertise that part. Celebrating some promotion, the invitation said, but I knew better. This was his victory lap. I still had that old key David had given me, the one to the coffin at the bottom of the sea. Carried it in my pocket as a reminder. Time to show him what that coffin had been hiding. The night of the party, I dressed in my work clothes. Jeans, flannel shirt, boots that had seen better decades. Wanted to look exactly like what David expected. The poor brother, coming to grovel or beg. His guests would love the contrast. His new house was everything Dad's wasn't. Modern, sterile, all glass and sharp angles. Music thumped from inside. Through the windows, I could see the crowd, David's investment banker friends, their trophy wives, everyone holding drinks that cost more than most people's groceries. I walked through his front door like I owned the place. People turned confused. I wasn't dressed for this party. Wasn't their kind. David spotted me from across the room, and his face went through several expressions, surprise, annoyance, then that satisfied smirk. He made his way over, holding champagne that probably cost $300 bottle. Michael, didn't expect you to come. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small chunk of ambergris, placed it on his marble counter between the champagne and the caviar. It looked exactly like what was a piece of something ancient and valuable that these people would never understand. You told me Dad left me a coffin at the bottom of the sea. I said, loud enough for the room to hear. The music seemed to dim, or maybe people were just listening now. I raised it. David stared at the gray chunk like it might bite him. What is that? Ambergris. Floating gold. Dad collected it for 30 years, stored it in the boat you call trash. I pulled out the evaluation report, laid it next to the piece. $4.2 million worth. The room went silent. Someone dropped a glass. David's face went white, then red, then white again. His mouth opened, closed, opened. No words came. But here's the interesting part. I continued, pulling out the lawyer's documents. While I was raising Dad's boat, my attorney was looking into that house sale. Funny thing about shell companies, they leave paper trails. You sold Dad's house for $150,000 to your friend's company. Market value was $500,000. His champagne glass shook. Drops hit his Italian marble floor. That's breach of fiduciary duty. Criminal fraud. The lawyer says you're looking at jail time, plus damages. I smiled then, and it felt good. See, David, you were so busy stealing nickels, you missed a fortune. Dad knew exactly who you were. That's why the real inheritance was in the one place you'd never look, in something that required actual work to get. The party had stopped completely. Everyone stared. David's reputation, his entire image, crumbling in real time. Someone was recording on their phone. By morning, this would be everywhere. "Michael, we can," he started. "No, we can't. The lawsuit gets filed Monday. Criminal charges to follow. Enjoy your party." I picked up the piece of ambergris, put it back in my pocket. That small chunk was worth more than everything in this room, but they'd never understand that. Just like David never understood Dad. Walking out, I heard the explosion of whispers behind me. David calling my name. Didn't turn around. Marines don't look back at things they've already destroyed. 2 days later, I found Billy in his shop, working under a truck that had seen better wars. Slid an envelope across his workbench without saying anything. He opened it, saw the check, and for once in his life, Billy Morrison was speechless. "That's for a new lift," I said, "and whatever else you need to pull other idiots out of the mud." He stared at the number, then at me. "Mike, this is what you earned, what you deserve. Dad would have wanted it." Billy grabbed my shoulder. "Squeeze hard enough to hurt. Your dad would be proud." Maybe, but that wasn't why I did it. The money from the ambergris went mostly to a foundation. Set up quiet, no name attached. Families of fishermen lost at sea. Kids who needed college funds. People who worked with their hands and got forgotten by folks like David. Kept enough to restore the sea wolf properly. She's beautiful now. Everything Dad would have wanted. Sometimes I take her out past the breakers, to the spots Dad marked his notebooks. Not hunting for ambergris. That was his quest, not mine. Just go to think. To remember. David lost everything. The lawsuit destroyed him. Criminal charges are pending. Last I heard, he was living in a studio apartment, working at a job where he had to wear a name tag. The fall from grace was complete. But I don't think about him much. He's just noise now, background static from a different life. The sea wolf rocks gently in her slip at the marina. She's not a coffin anymore. She's what she always was. A keeper of secrets, a patient hunter, a bridge between father and son. When the sun hits the water just right, when the salt spray catches the wind, I can almost hear Dad laughing. David thought inheritance was something you could count, something you could put in a bank. But real inheritance lives in your bones, in the choices you make, in the work you're willing to do when everyone thinks you're crazy. In my blood, there's salt. In my pocket, there's still that rusty key. Not because I need it anymore, but because some things are worth carrying. And somewhere out there, in the deep water Dad loved, there's probably more floating gold, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. But that's someone else's treasure now. I already found mine. It was never about the ambergris. It was about proving that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Not because they're smarter or richer or better connected, but because they're willing to get their hands dirty, to raise the dead, to believe in something everyone else calls worthless. That's the real floating gold, and no amount of money can buy it.